few minutes later than anticipated, I'll go ahead and call this January 16th, 2018 meeting of the Whitefish City Council to order. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for attending this evening. And our first order of business is our Pledge of Allegiance, and I would like to ask Joan to lead us tonight. Thank you, Joan. Our next item of business is to administer the oath of office to our incoming City Councilor, Melissa Hartman. Congratulations, Melissa. Melissa was on vacation for our first meeting in January, at which meeting Andy Fury as well as Ryan Hennon were sworn in to serve their four-year terms as well. So I'm going to take the floor and invite Melissa down to join me to administer the oath of office. Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Melissa Hartman,
I, Melissa Hartman,
as a City Councilor of the City of Whitefish,
as a City Councilor of the City of Whitefish,
Montana,
do
solemnly swear that I will support, protect, and defend
the
Constitution of the United States,
the Constitution of the United States,
the Constitution of the State of Montana,
the Constitution of the State of Montana,
and that I will discharge the duties of my office
and that I will discharge the duties of my office
with fidelity, so help me God.
with fidelity, so help me God.
Congratulations, Melissa.
Thank you.
Welcome aboard. All right, we have a full house. So we will move on to item 4 of our agenda. There's a short proclamation I'm going to read in honor of Arbor Day, and we do this annually here at the city, so please bear with me. Whereas natural areas, trees, and landscapes provide not only community beautification, but also economic and environmental benefits, and whereas trees provide many benefits to the community, including air purification, windbreaks, noise reduction, shade, and energy savings, and whereas planting trees and maintaining older trees provides an opportunity for community interaction, volunteerism, economic development, and environmental conservation. And whereas our efforts to improve the environmental benefits, whereas our efforts to improve the environment benefit present and future generations, and whereas Arbor Day in Montana is officially the last Friday in April, be it therefore resolved, I, John Mulfeld, Mayor of Whitefish, Montana, do hereby proclaim Friday, April 27th, 2018 as Arbor Day, and I encourage citizens to participate in appropriate activities and to take advantage of the benefits of the parks and other natural areas in our community. Thanks very much. Moving on to communications from the public. This is time set aside for the public to comment on items that are on the agenda but not advertised as a public hearing. So if you are here for any of the 4 public hearings, please wait to provide comment until at which time that public hearing is called. But general comments to the council are welcome, and we'll start with Dave Fern.
Good evening, new council. My name is Dave Fern. I live at 211 Dakota Avenue here in Whitefish. As some of you may recall, last month you started the public hearing, which is lettered A, and we had a wide-ranging discussion that included the Wisconsin Avenue corridor, safety on the road, issues around the ability to handle traffic and development. Since then, I've worked a little bit with the Montana Department of Transportation to get some input and to relay some of the concerns I heard at that meeting. And I spoke with the regional director in Missoula about an opportunity to meet with the stakeholders on a secondary road such as Wisconsin and East Lake Shore. That include MDT, that would include the city of Whitefish, and that would include the county. And I also offer my services to facilitate or participate from the legislative standpoint. Mr. Taves, who's the regional director, is very willing to meet. I've relayed this news to City Manager Hammett, and I am willing to work with him to put this together. I mentioned to Mr. Taves that the sooner the better, with traffic not flowing any slower, as we have increased visibility nationally and internationally. So we're looking at potentially next month to meet and start a discussion about what is the future of Wisconsin Avenue and what we can do. And I realize I can't take any questions, so we'll do that another day, another time. So you can communicate at some point with City Manager Hammett, and I've discussed this beforehand with Mayor Mulfeld.
Jen.
Good evening, Jen Franzen, 12 Dakota Avenue, Whitefish. It is good to be on the other side and seeing some new faces.
Good to see you.
Later on tonight on your agenda, towards the end of your agenda, there is a resolution establishing Whitefish Tourism Master Plan Steering Committee. I am one of the co-owners of Old Town Creative and Interactive. We are the agency of record for the Whitefish Convention and Visitor Bureau. And last spring, we brought forward to the city and had a joint work session with the city regarding a tourism master plan. And in that discussion was moving forward with a plan would include a joint effort between the city and the Convention and Visitor Bureau. So to do that, we are establishing a committee that would be representative of the public as stated in the resolution. If you have any questions tonight, Dylan from the Whitefish Convention and Visitor Bureau will be here to ask or answer any of those questions that you may have. But just know that this is one of those steps that we had talked about. It's the next one to get the ball rolling so that we can get a budget in front of the city and the CVB this spring prior to budget season. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate your time tonight. Jen.
Mayor, City Council, welcome Melissa. Jan Metzbaker, 915 Dakota. Two quick things. I was wondering if the city had received any updates from DEQ regarding the plume, the diesel plume under the rail yard, and what the remediation plan, where the status of that is, because I tried to keep track and I haven't received anything in a long time. And the second thing is, with the fiasco that just happened in Hawaii, it reminds me of, I've been to council before on this, about what is an evacuation plan for Whitefish, a notification plan, is it the siren? Are you gonna text people, call people? Should there be a wildfire or a blow up at the rail yard? That concerns me. I know in Missoula they have a website. You can log on to their website and put your phone number in there and they'll text you if there's any kind of emergency. Do we know where handicapped and elderly people are? You know, all that database. And I know I've asked this before. And could we have some kind of plan for the public? Maybe it's out there. I've heard it is, but it'd be nice for people to have some assurance that if there was an emergency, there would be a certain protocol and things would happen and people would be notified.
Thanks, Jan. Adam or Craig, have we received an update from DEQ? I have not in recent months.
I haven't seen anything, no.
Okay.
But
I'll follow up at the end of the meeting with you regarding this. Mary.
Good evening, Mary Flowers, Citizens for Bear Flathead, 35 4th Street West in Kalispell. And before I raise 2 points with you, asking you to add yet a couple more items to your task list, I want to appreciate the fact that Whitefish has really stepped up and is trying on a lot of fronts to deal with a lot of really critical issues. And so as an organization, we very much appreciate your leadership and your proactive work that you're doing on a number of fronts. Having said that, I would like to ask you to add a couple of items to your to-do list. And I think one is an existing item, but I think it needs to be given higher priority. and that is when you adopted the amendments to your downtown master plan, implementing those into zoning and also into the architectural standards are key requirements to move forward with that plan. And I think given the level of development coming into the city, that's going to be really crucial that that gets attention quickly. The second item is an item that I think the city of Kalispell has been grappling with and has not yet dealt with. And I think you have the opportunity to look at it somewhat proactively, but I also think it's a issue that not only you, but in my research, it looks like communities across the country are addressing, and that is this issue of the loss of tax base when you have a nonprofit entity coming in and doing land development in your community. There have been some really creative approaches to establishing standards so that when you look at the scope of land use that a nonprofit might bring to your community, that there are ways to put some sideboards on that and to make sure that there's a fair standard for all folks developing in the city. I walked off without my handout for you on that tonight, but I will later this evening email you a couple of links that provide some background. One is just a general overview on that as a zoning issue. And second is an example of some legislation that the state of Washington put in place to try to address that issue. So I'll leave you with those two thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Further comment from the public tonight? We'll stay with the audience. Any volunteer board reports from the audience? How about the council? Richard.
Just an update, the CAP will probably be bringing you our new timeline, but we're on track to finish the plan, so the climate action plan, and it will include some information on community outreach.
Thanks, Richard. Further reports from the council? Katie.
911 funding committee.
Let's leave it on.
There we go. The 911 Funding Committee will be meeting again next Wednesday at the Flathead Emergency Service Communications Center at 6 o'clock. Hopefully we will have a sound report for the 911 Administration Board at the beginning of next month.
Thanks, Katie. Further board reports? Not seeing any, I'll move on to the consent agenda. Any changes or additions to the January 2nd, 2018 minutes, or can I have a motion for approval? I'll take changes first. Richard, any changes?
I'll move to approve.
Seconded by Councilor Fury. Further discussion on the motion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and that motion carries unanimously. Michelle, which brings us on to item 8 of our agenda, which are our scheduled public hearings. We do have 4 public hearings this evening. We'll start with item A, which was postponed from a prior council meeting back in December, and this is consideration of an application from Wisconsin Development Partners for a conditional use permit to develop 66 condominium cabins and 36 multifamily condominiums comprised of 3 12-plexes located at 700 and 900 Wisconsin Avenue. And again, this is a continuation, and we did hold the public hearing open, so we will be taking public comment tonight on this item. Wendy.
Good evening. So again, this was a matter that was before you folks in December, and you continued until tonight in order for the applicant to provide additional information to address some identified concerns. So the public hearing, again, as the mayor mentioned, was left open until tonight, and the applicant also agreed to this extension. The council is concerned about peak seasonal traffic combined with a resort residential type development, the type of residential use identified in the traffic impact study, possible left-hand turn lanes on Wisconsin Avenue, the extension of East Marina Crest and traffic impact on Dakota Avenue, and finally the emergency access from the multifamily condominiums to the south of the project. The applicant did submit some additional information that's at the end of your packet, which includes an updated site plan and an updated traffic impact study. Just to provide a bit of a summary, Michelle, on page 148 is the updated staff or site plan. Just to talk about some of the changes that they proposed or they made here. They did remove the secondary emergency access that was to the south of the apartments that was going to cross the bike paths. Folks had concerns about how would we prevent other traffic from using that emergency access. The site plan now creates a loop around the multifamily. Both accesses are off of East Marina Crest Lane. The fire department has reviewed this design and finds it acceptable. As part of this change in circulation, they changed the buildings, and instead of the 3 12-plexes, they're proposing 2 18-plexes. So the buildings are larger, but the density is unchanged. The updated site plan shows a dedication of 16 feet for future right-of-way. In the area along where the multifamily is, for some reason there was a little bit of a jog in the lot, and so there was a little bit wider right-of-way through there. So they're continuing that sort of jog in front of the multifamily all the way up through all of those parcels, which is an additional 16 feet they're proposing to dedicate. There are plans, I think, of having a 3-lane section, not too different than Highway 93 West, with a center turn lane and 2 driving lanes, and that requires an 80-foot right-of-way. So with this 16-foot dedication, there would be 76 feet of right-of-way along their frontage, so nearly accommodating that. So we did talk to MDT about this proposal, the 16 feet, and they were satisfied with that. However, they're unable to accept the dedicated right-of-way at this time, and so they asked that it be dedicated to the city until such time as MDT can accept that. So as such, staff is recommending an additional condition, number 16, that the 16-foot of right-of-way would be dedicated to the city of Whitefish prior to submitting any building permits for phase 1, and that they would agree to maintain that strip of property until it becomes a Montana Department of Transportation right-of-way. Because of the complexities associated with a left-hand turn lane, it can't be installed at this time. MDT does need to review the entire corridor and determine what types of improvements need to be made along the entire corridor. They were satisfied, though, with the updated TIS and the 16-foot right-of-way. Finally, the updated site plan shows all the internal roads as 2-way in compliance with a recommended condition of approval from planning board and staff. You'll recall that a few of the roads in the cabin portions were 1-way, and we didn't want to see that. They did do an updated traffic study, and I think their consultants and the applicant is here and they can speak to more detail about that. But they did do a traffic count during the seasonal peak, which was on December 29th. They provided an explanation of the type of residential use that was done for the study and possible impacts on Dakota Avenue once East Marina Crest is constructed to the west. The engineer continues to note that the traffic can be readily accommodated with good levels of service and no significant delays at the studied intersections. Staff has reviewed the TIS and agrees with its conclusions. Finally, I think that's the last thing. There were some questions about connecting Wisconsin Avenue over to Dakota Avenue through East Marina Crest Lane. And it should be noted that this connection is not going to be made at this time. The city is going to get all the right-of-way all the way to the western border of this project, but only about half the road is actually going to be constructed to city standards. Providing connections between and within neighborhoods is always a planning priority for the city when we review development proposals. It provides better opportunities for vehicles and pedestrians and bicyclists and emergency services, rather than funneling all traffic out onto one road. I did attach a subdivision called Northview Subdivision, which is to the west of this development proposal that was approved. The final plot was approved by the council in 2002. And while from Dakota Avenue, it looks like it's just a cul-de-sac, kind of a dead end, the city did get right-of-way all the way to their eastern border of this project. So even the vision for extending this road to Wisconsin Avenue was, way back then in 2002. And an east-west connector is important. And again, the applicant is here to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Wendy. Any questions for Wendy from the council? Richard.
Wendy, on the new condition 16, on the dedication of that additional right-of-way, is there a provision to make sure that that remains weed-free, or they control the weeds?
Well,
I guess
that's implied, I guess, but we could add that if you'd like to.
Yeah, I would.
Is that it, Richard?
That's it, until a couple of questions for the
Applicant?
proponent.
Sure. Any other questions for Wendy? Not seeing any. We did advertise for a public hearing on what will be item 8A of our agenda, and we'll hold that public hearing now. I believe the applicant is in the audience. Will, would you like to address the council?
Will McDonald, 180 Fauna Road. I just want to, again, thank the council for letting us table this, because I think that this new site plan addresses the concerns that was expressed on December 4th, and I also think that the site plan has gotten better. Wendy did a really good job going over everything, but, you know, Councilmember Hildner, we heard you loud and clear on the emergency access, and I think the layout is better. The fire and safety, when we sat down at site plan, liked it better as well, so we heard you guys. With respects to the traffic and the concerns along Wisconsin, you know, we took the initiative, and Bruce Booty brought it to our attention that there was already a 16-foot right-of-way in our southern parcel, and so we extended it all the way through. So again, with the future, you know, you've got the mountain that's going to get developed. I mean, Whitefish is going to grow, and so by giving right-of-way to the city, we're giving you guys the tools so that Wisconsin can grow like 93 North. So again, Wendy did a really good job with the detail, and I think we'll turn over to questions. But with the TIS, you know, we performed that on December 29th, and as we said in the sheet, it was the second highest day in the ski hill, like 7,300 people. So again, we tried to get the data so that we could really look at this and be able to answer questions. So with that, you know, I'll turn it over to you guys. Brett's here. If you have any specific questions on the TIS, if you have questions on the site plan, I can handle those.
Thanks, Will. Any questions for Will at this time? Richard?
What's your provision for snow storage?
Provision for snow storage, good question. What we did is, with the distances from the houses, or rather the single-family condo cabins, Bruce we can get a little bit more detailed, but I feel like with the setbacks between all the roads, there was at least 5 feet to 10 feet, and so it'd be bioswales, and it wouldn't be curb and gutter, so it wouldn't stack up, but it would be sort of elevated and then bioswale down. So the thought is that we would have ample room with our snowpack in city to be able to push. We would have snow removal equipment on site. The whole thing is to try and have private equipment to take care of it, and operate sort of like a subdivision.
Have you done that calculation to see, in fact, that you do have enough volume? Space to deal with that volume?
No, we haven't done a specific analysis.
Additional questions for Will or Brett for that matter? Not seeing any for the moment, but if anything pops up, we'll call you back up. Thanks, Will.
Thank you, sir.
Yep. Public comment this evening on this item. Just your name and address for the record, please.
So Mary Flowers, Citizens for Bear Flathead, 35 4th Street West in Kalispell. The packet that I've just handed out to you is not to overwhelm you tonight, but it's just to provide you a reference to the documents that I'm referring to in my comments on this CUP. In general, we appreciate that the applicant has made changes to address some of the issues that both the public and the council raised during your review at your December council meeting. Our comments focus on 2 policy issues that we think are central to your final decision on the proposed Whitefish CUP to be consistent not only with the CUP request before you, but with other CUPs that come before you in the future. As your hearing record reflects, numerous residents in the Wisconsin neighborhood have expressed almost disbelief that a development of this density is possible at the site under Whitefish zoning regulations, and their concern with multiple negative impacts this density would have on traffic and transportation, as well as property values and the character and compatibility of the development with the neighborhood. The possible options before you are to condition, accept, or deny the CUP request. There are two CUP requests before you. One is to allow a 5-plex or larger on a lot, and the second is to allow more than one principal use. Without these two CUPs, the greatest density possible under the existing zoning is 1 4-plex on each of the 3 lots, or 12 units total. So let me turn back to the key 2 policy issues upon which your decision needs to be made. One is the conditional use permit. You are not required to approve the CUP. In fact, you would be required to deny it if you do not adopt specific findings and evidence that support your approval. And so I've included for you the wording out of your own regulations there, that the burden of proof is on the applicant, that a conditional use is a matter of grace, that just because a use is listed as a condition, if you don't find that it can be consistent and compatible with the neighborhood, if there's overwhelming traffic issues, et cetera, you are basically required to make findings to deny the CUP. So it's not a automatic, let's just condition this and adopt it. And I've provided you the standards there for that. You, of course, have the option to adopt findings that support the request before you. However, one finding that you must adopt under the required criteria for approval of a CUP under your own regulations is that the proposed PUD is, as under finding 1 of the staff report, that the proposed use is consistent with the purpose, intent, and applicable provisions of the Whitefish regulations. That's right from the staff report, that's finding 1. And I've really struggled with this. I've looked at it and gone, I guess they can just do it. I guess they can just do it. And then I had this moment today where I went, no, this doesn't make sense. So I want to walk you through that, and I'm sorry that I'm bringing this to you at the last minute, but I know you've struggled with it, I've struggled with it, so this is my analysis. So the key regulation that is pivotal here is this 11.2-3 use regulation, which says only 1 principal use is allowed per lot of record. Multiple principal uses may be allowed on a single lot of record upon the issuance of a conditional use permit. So that's what you're being asked to do, to approve more than 1 principal use. So what I did is I went back and looked at this regulation and ordinance that are referred to at the end of this statute, or the end of this regulation. The second one just refers to the architectural features and how far they can extend into right-of-ways, et cetera. So it's not really directly related. The one that is related and that is in your packet is this ordinance 97-2. The planning staff's interpretation of this regulation, as I understand it from talking to them, is that when multiple principal uses are granted through a CUP like the one before you tonight, and since this particular zone, the WRR1 zone, has no minimum lot sizes, unlimited buildings or structures in keeping with the principal uses approved may be allowed on the 3 lots under the proposed CUP. However, in reviewing the minutes from this council meeting back in '97, when this ordinance was passed, this issue of no limits to buildings was a concern to that council. When questions were raised regarding the number of buildings allowed as proposed in the ordinance, the planning staff at that time, who was a Mark Sawyer, explained that that multiple buildings would be allowed. Mayor Stevens, however, expressed concern about this and how that might negatively impact the integrity of residential zones. Thus, when Councilor Hope made the motion to adopt this ordinance, he specifically amended the ordinance to strike the option for multiple buildings and structures. With this change, the motion passed unanimously. And I have that, the minutes and the ordinance in what I handed you, just so you have them for reference. Thus, regardless of what you may think about the merits of the proposal before you, wonderful or way too dense, you, I believe, are bound legally to follow not the staff's interpretation of this CUP ordinance, but the actual intent of the ordinance as it was amended and passed by the council in 1997. In the interest of due process, this application and future applications where the staff's current interpretation may be even more problematic in the application require that you follow your own regulations to follow your own regulations, not as just as your staff is currently interpreting them. Additionally, the ordinance passed in 1997 included an additional 6 conditions that were to also govern multiple uses on the same lot, which I do not now find in your regulations. One of these required that when you have multiple principal uses, there was a limit to the signage and that a master sign plan must be submitted as part of the CUP application. Such plan I do not believe was part of this application. I was unable to do additional research to find why these 6 conditions have not been codified or where they have been perhaps added that I simply did not find them. Additional review of this ordinance is merited, I believe, and I've attached the minutes for both of the ordinances referred to. Finally, in looking at how your staff arrived at this interpretation of the ordinance, I also looked at as if this density could have been created by classifying this number of additional buildings as your regulations classify as accessory buildings, and conclude that this was also not possible. And I've attached the relevant code for that. So I think what is the situation you're faced with is that this density is not allowed under your zoning regulations and therefore is not allowed for you to comply with the criteria which is required for you to approve this development. I'm not sure if this came back as a subdivision, how it would have to change, what additional criteria they might have to go through. But I think this is a policy issue that is critical not only to this particular proposal before you, but as you move forward and have other applications come in, when a neighborhood is really relying on the zoning for density, the misinterpretation of this can really lead to significant issues and impacts in the neighborhood. So I'm more than glad. I know that's a lot. I can go back over something if you'd like and answer questions, but the relevant document that, if you want to read the actual wording of the zoning, is this document that is the top. It's council meeting October 6, 1997. It says text amendment zoning ordinance, and then this last paragraph here, on my copy is highlighted in yellow. It wasn't highlighted on yours. And then the next 2 paragraphs are really where the minutes reflect exactly what the wording of that ordinance was. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Further public comment tonight? Jan. You were on the list.
No wonder. Jan Metzmaker, 915 Dakota Avenue. I'm a concerned neighbor. I kind of look at this development from my house, and my end of Dakota has no street lights, no curbs, no gutters, no sidewalks, and the rest of Dakota is very narrow. And when I hear about plans for roads to access between Wisconsin and Dakota, I kind of set up an alarm bell. It may disperse traffic, but it's going to set an awful lot of traffic down this road. And I know Richard runs on it, joggers, we have bikers, and it's very popular because it's off Wisconsin. And people in our neighborhood don't want to have more traffic flowing through that area because it really can't accommodate it. And I think it's patently unfair to subject the residents of our neighborhood to these overnight rentals where you're going to have congestion, traffic, noise, parties, disruption, because everything around it is a single-family home. And I know it's zoned for resort residential, but it doesn't fit the neighborhood. It's also very unwise to approve this project without rebuilding Wisconsin to allow a left-hand turn lane. And I see they've done a traffic study for December 29th when 8,000 people come off the mountain, but in the summer we have 30,000 people in town, and that's a lot of people. And I cannot exit Glenwood or LaBrie and get on Wisconsin most days. I have to go out the other way. I think it's also unwise to approve it if we don't know if the Wisconsin corridor plan is going to be approved, and this is a big project to add to that plan. I think this development is too dense, the buildings are too tall, and they're not going to fit with the neighborhood. And I thought it was interesting that Mary's brought up that resolution or the zoning regulations, and I guess I seconded that motion, and I don't even remember that. But anyway, I hope you'll kind of look at what was said there. I think it's important that we look at our town and how it grows, and is this going to be an asset to what we need for this town, more overnight rentals.
Thanks, Jan.
Did you get the letter from Jim Hytel in your packet?
Yes.
Just want to make sure.
We did. Thanks. Further public testimony? Going once, twice, I'll go ahead and close the public hearing and turn it back to council for discussion or a motion. Who would like to start?
I think somebody wants to.
I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand. Sorry. Going to go ahead and reopen the public hearing.
Joan Vetter Ehrenberg, 744 Hidden Valley Drive, Whitefish. What concerns me is the density is way too dense for our community and for that road to handle for Wisconsin and Dakota, a quiet neighborhood in our community. But what also concerns me is this development group comes along and imposes all of this growth onto the community, and the community has to deal with it. We have to wait for the state to do the TIS, the traffic impact study, and then we're going to get another suicide lane. Is that going to answer it? We really have to be strong on how that area is approaching traffic. Right now, on a powder day, you all know it's backed up to the post office from Alpine, all the way to the Big Mountain Road. And so we need to look at the density. I think it's way too dense, and look at the traffic study. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. One more time, any further public testimony? Rhonda.
Good evening, councilors and mayor. Rhonda Fitzgerald, 412 Lupfer Ave. I did make this comment earlier, but I'm going to rephrase it. When LaChance came forward with this originally 10 years ago, it was 12 vacation cabins on 3 lots, 4 per lot. And people said, okay. Now with just a magic trick, it's 102 units. This is mind-boggling to an average person that by doing some paperwork, you can turn 12 into 102, because it's completely different than what was originally promised the community, envisioned, explained by the planners. And I think that going forward is a big issue. How does something go from 12 to 102? Because it's way too many. We can't handle that many vacation rentals in that location. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. Further public comment? Not seeing any, I will close the public hearing and turn it back to the council. Frank?
Mr. Mayor, if I could ask Wendy or David a question. I hesitate to ask these questions without having the definitive answer, but what kind of, without a WCUP, if we just went, this property came to us, wanted to be as fully developed as it could be, what kind of densities could be allowed on those 3 lots?
So the zoning density is 10 dwelling units per acre. And so that's where they got with the 102. Because there's 3 separate lots, the most they could have is a 4-plex on each of the 3 lots. That would be 12. And so that's what they could do without coming before, you folks for any sort of request. No subdivision, no conditional use permit, just a use by right, architectural review, and a building permit.
They could put 100 units, you say, or 12?
No, they could put 12. A 4-plex on each lot, each of the 3 lots.
But the density allowed would be 10 units per acre.
Yeah, that's the maximum density under the zoning.
And how many acres?
Well, whatever it is, it's 10.
That's with a subdivision too, Frank.
Right,
Pardon?
yeah, whether they did
With the subdivision, I mean, it's also has a use for 80 trailer houses that are on there that's grandfathered, so I mean, you gotta factor that density in as well, but.
I think there's 40 trailers on there. 44, thank you. There's 44 trailers on there right now. And I would point out that the Swift Current cabins, the 2008 approval that you folks granted, Tom LaChance was for 54 cabins. And it was only on the 2 northerly lots. The southern lot wasn't part of his project at that time. That, I can't remember what that guy's name was. He was gonna do kind of a duplexy type project.
Right, I remember that. Thank you.
Frank?
Mr. Mayor, at the risk of being a bit of a heel, I'm going to move to approve WCUP 1710, findings of fact, and the staff report, and the 15 conditions, or 16, I guess, conditions of approval now, as recommended by the Whitefish Planning Board on November 16th, 2017. If I get a second, I'll speak a little bit to it.
Thank you, Frank. Is there a second to the motion?
I second.
Seconded by Councilor Williams. Councilor Sweeney?
I agree with some of the comments of our citizens that if on an ideal situation, I would not necessarily want this kind of density or uses that would be allowed in this in terms of nightly rentals and short-term rentals. However, that's not how this property is zoned. And it's been zoned that way for a very long time, unfortunately. Even if we'd looked at this, any reduction in the numbers that would have been allowed on this acreage, these 3 lots, would have been, I think, taken as a taking in many respects, and I don't think any of us want to be in that position. I think we've got a pretty good proposal here. We can argue about the densities and how they're allocated, but given what I know and have learned about the zoning and what is permitted on that property under the circumstances, I've moved to approve.
Thank you, Frank. Further discussion on the motion? Richard?
Let me know when you're ready for an additional condition.
Okay, go ahead.
I'd like to start with condition 17, and that is that the proponent would maintain the Marina Crest right-of-way as open space with the obligation of controlling noxious weeds until such time as the right-of-way is constructed.
Is there a second to that friendly amendment, which will be condition number 17, if I'm not mistaken?
I'll second.
Further discussion on the friendly amendment. We'll vote on the amendment first before going back to the original motion.
Can you restate your amendment, please?
Yes, the proponent will maintain the Marina Crest right-of-way. That's that section right through there as a weed-free open space until such time as that is constructed. My concern is, may I speak to that?
Yes.
my concern is that that could be just a dumping ground for any number of people wanting to just, I don't know, get rid of their stuff out of this project, and become a weed garden. So that's why I'd like to see that.
Further discussion on the amended condition, which will be condition number 17. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and that amendment, which will be condition number 17, passes unanimously. Michelle, which does bring us back to the original motion for approval as amended. Is there any further discussion on the original motion? Richard?
It bothers me that we have missed a great opportunity here for an affordable housing component. It is a huge subdivision that's been proposed. It's essentially 102 hotel rooms. And it concerns me, but I don't have a good answer for how you're going to deal with the number of people that are going to be brought in to make beds, to do lawn care, building maintenance. I think that it's really unfortunate that we've missed this opportunity, and I don't think it's necessarily the best thing for Whitefish. But on the other hand, I've really struggled with a reason or to find findings that would preclude me approving, unless somebody can convince me otherwise.
Thank you, Richard. Further discussion on the original motion, which will include added condition number 17. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign. And the motion does carry on a 4-2 vote with Councilor Fury and Hartman voting in opposition. Thanks for your attendance tonight, both to the public as well as the applicant. We will move on to item 8B. I'll let people filter out before we take on the next item. We'll move on to item 8B, which is consideration of an application from 8th Street LLC for a conditional use permit to convert an existing building into a professional office and develop a triplex located at 144 West 2nd Street, and this is zone WR3, and this will be WCUP 17-13. Wendy.
Okay. So again, this is a request for a conditional use permit to develop a residential triplex and convert an existing structure into a professional office at 144 West 2nd Street. The property is zone WR3. The proposed condominium triplex will be located at the top of the Whitefish, up top of the bank of the Whitefish River, and they're proposing to retain the existing structure and remodel it into a professional office. This existing structure was once a hair salon and was permitted by the city as a home occupation. Access to the site was established with the recent rebuild of the Highway 93 West and will not be changing with this proposal. There is a main access to the site to the east of the existing structure with a small driveway and a carport. The applicant will be providing a parking lot with 11 parking spaces. 3 are proposed to be covered. The triplex is proposed to be located at the top of the Whitefish River bank. The applicant submitted cross-section of the riverbank showing the top of bank and the 20-foot setback. The applicant, as allowed through the water quality protection regulations, is taking advantage of the buffer reduction option that permits one to reduce the buffer by 25% with a restoration plan. This locates the building at 101.5 feet, or about 7.5 feet down from the top of the bank. The applicant does intend to restore the buffer area and install a pedestrian path, which is also permitted in the water quality regulations to the river for the residential use. A conditional use permit is required for this project because there's more than one principal use in the proposed lot, both the residential and the professional offices. And the WR3 requires, zoning district requires a conditional use permit for professional offices. The property is a little more than half an acre, again, zone WR3, which is our low-density multifamily residential district. The growth policy land use designation is high-density residential, which corresponds to the WR3. We did notice adjacent landowners, and then legal was placed in the pilot, and we noticed advisory agencies, and we didn't receive any comments on this proposal. We review conditional use permits according to the criteria in the zoning regulations. The growth policy designates this area as high-density residential, which is consistent with the WR3 zone. The applicant is able to meet the setbacks, density, parking, height, and lot coverage standards, and a number of those will be reviewed at the time of building permit. The access requirements are being met. The triplex will be sprinklered as an offset for access under quality and functionality of the site plan. So the parking lot location and layout is acceptable, traffic circulation is acceptable, and then the open space is not a requirement for a conditional use permit, but the river buffer will be an open space that will be accessible by a private trail for the residents. This property is well situated to take advantage of surrounding recreational amenities, including the Ped Bike Trail and the river, Grouse Mountain Park, and nearby City Beach. The applicant is proposing a native restoration area in the buffer. In addition, they'll have a landscaping plan that will accompany the building permit. The property is served by water, sewer, and they're proposing to have on-site stormwater system. The traffic study was not required for this project because it fell under the 200 trip threshold. And then under neighborhood and community compatibility, they will have to get architectural review approval, and scale, mass, and neighborhood context is an important part of their review. The planning board held a public hearing on December 21st. The applicant and his consultant spoke at that hearing. The planning board did recommend approval. It was a close vote of 3-2. The planning board raised some concerns related to the slopes, the buffer restoration, and stormwater management, and the applicant submitted additional information, which is at the end of your packet. And again, just to hit the highlights for the conditions, planning board recommended approval subject to 10 conditions of approval. One of those conditions is a final plan for buffer restoration would be submitted and approved prior to the issuance of a building permit. In addition, they'll submit a geotechnical letter along with the building permit. The existing single-family residence that's proposed to be converted into a professional office will need a professional design. And this needs to be reviewed and approved by the building department. And then the conditional use permit is valid for 18 months. And I do know the applicant is here, and he has his consultant team to help answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Wendy. Any questions for Wendy on her staff report? Richard.
Wendy, aren't the restoration plan and or the geotech required before we would approve this?
No, those are submitted with the building permit. They can, and as is submitted to this application is sort of conceptual. They know what they're gonna do, but the actual details and the engineering and the landscaping plan always come with the building permit.
Okay, I'll come back.
Further questions for Wendy? Thanks, Wendy. Not seeing any. We did advertise for a public hearing on what is item 8B, and I will ask Jason, if you're here in attendance, if you'd like to address the council, now would be the time. Just your name and address for the record, please.
Hi, I'm Jason Pullman, 325 Moonridge Drive, Whitefish. So I am the applicant. I'm also with Mindful Designs. The 8th Street is just the owner of the property. And we have done the other two projects that are very similar to this at 50 West and 118 West 2nd Street. So just a little background there. I wanted to just say some of the same things that Wendy did, but just to highlight a couple things. You know, that this plan does fall within the Whitefish growth policy. You know, supporting, you know, urban infill development is another way to say, you know, more density closer to town is gonna, you know, promote people to walk into town, lowering traffic in town, and parking needs, everything benefits with that. And then with the professional office, it was used as a business previously. There's other light commercial in that corridor, and it is approved for that district. And reusing that existing building is something that we feel good about, so that, the alternative, if you're gonna try to maximize the density, would be to tear it down and put it in the landfill. And so it's a quality building that we feel we can utilize it and have this residential triplex still fit on that lot comfortably for both uses. We did hear everything from the planning board and try to take some action on those items. We'd been looking at this property since September and October. At that time, we had industry professionals helping us evaluate the feasibility analysis, specifically with the geotech and the buffer reduction. Just to say again, included, we got a letter from Greg Gunderson with Forestation. He did do his site evaluation at that time and made record of what plants were on the site and what a restoration plan would look like to qualify us for that buffer reduction. Unfortunately, he's out of town. He couldn't make it tonight, but he did include the letter of support, with detail. We did update the building plans, just a little bit more detail, and that's what I wanted to show on there, just what that looks like, that top of bank designation and what the restoration is. Just, it's a good visual to show. It's a 7-foot over top of bank that we're looking for with the buffer restoration. So the remaining 101 feet of buffer is to the mean high water. We do have Josh Smith with Slopeside Engineering. He submitted a geotech letter, and he is here. If there's any more detailed questions, he can address those. And we also initiated our stormwater management plan with A to Z Engineering. So we did submit one of his exhibits. It's still in progress, but it's essentially the same water management plan. We're collecting all the stormwater from the parking area and controlling how it is managed, so in terms of stability on that hillside, it's actually getting hard piped to a detention pond down below, and that breaks up the velocity of the water so it's not eroding on the surface, and it's also not loading that hillside with that additional weight from the water. Some technical detail that we have engineers that are going to help us manage that plan at the time of submitting, like Wendy mentioned. We did have the top of bank designation with Randy Overton. Just to clarify, that's where we're determining this. That was with the city. That's been something that we'd put time in earlier in the fall. So that's pretty solid there, we feel like. So yeah, certainly with all the conditions of approval, a lot of those are kind of within our standard permit application that we'd be addressing those. We did take action on the ones that seemed, we'd already initiated. And then the 310 permit is with Flathead Conservation District. We are already kind of starting to fill that out as well. So that's all I have at this time. I said Josh is available for any technical questions on the geotech side, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions if there's any.
Thanks, Jason. Questions for Jason? Richard?
At the planning board, you decided or stated that it was hard to determine where the top of bank was because of so much material having been pushed over the bank over the years, much as what happened on 95, they discovered at 95 Caro. At 95 Caro, they agreed to remove all of that non-native material and replace it with native material. I see nothing in your proposal that would do that, and thus it brings to me, or makes me question exactly where the top of the bank is and how you're going to stabilize that. So that's my first question, if you want to take a shot at that.
Sure. So, and Josh can back me up if I need any detail here, but one thing I can certainly say is within our standard construction techniques, we run into soil questions all the time, you know, and so if there's ever a question about the stability of the soil, it's coming out and we're replacing it. So in that regard, it's no different than any other project in the stability of the soil. Yeah, do you want to take a shot at that as well?
So the designation on this one was that the top of bank was looked at by staff, and you could see where that's located there. But over the top of that, because of the buffer reduction, if you remember on the 95 Carroll project, it was indiscernible. There's not nearly as much fill here as there was there, as far as the way it appears on the surface. We haven't done any borings and whatnot, but looking at the bank all along there, this definitely looks similar to what we're seeing in the other areas, and they've dug 2 other excavations in this area just down the road. I think it's
50 west and 118.
So they're familiar with that area. Also, you can see there that there is a lower level, so 12 feet of that's coming out anyway, and so there's a lot of material coming out, and so when that excavation occurs, that will be observed and make sure that we're on native soils and we don't have a stability issue.
So you've done no borings at all, so you don't really know what's there? Is that what you just told me?
We haven't done any borings there. Fairly certain what's there, and we'll confirm it when we dig.
Okay. May I continue?
Yes, please.
So why is it necessary to build into the buffers and setbacks? Why can't you just follow the regulation as written? And would that, if you did that, would it still be necessary to build a retention pond in the buffer area?
Well, the first part of the question, you know, to maximize the density to support the growth policy and the infill higher density, we'd have to tear down the existing building. That's a decision that we tried to avoid. Parking becomes challenging. You know, the shape of this lot is very long, but because of the top of bank designation, the buildable area is very short. So that's the direction that we've gone with our design. And I don't know how to answer the stormwater management plan because we just haven't followed that path of design.
Okay. So if you're extending 7 feet, you said, into the bank, or over the bank?
Over the bank, yes.
How many feet deep from that point are you?
Well, you know...
In other words, how big of an excavation into the bank are you going to make?
Well, it comes back towards 2nd Street. The is 27 feet, 30 feet. So it'd be 23 feet into the hillside, where it's currently flat. 7 feet, so it drops down, and it'll have a daylight basement effect. So those lower floor have full light out towards the river and the mountains to the north.
Okay.
Can I follow up on that, Richard?
Sure.
So relative to the top of bank elevation, maybe this is a question for Josh, are you going down 12 feet vertically into the slope or 7.5 feet?
Yeah, 12 feet vertically.
So basically the finished floor elevation of the basement will be roughly at 3019, which is still...
Well, yeah. And that included footers, so it's not quite there.
Right, so you're still 17 feet vertically above the ordinary high water mark of the river and 102 feet setback with the setback.
Yeah.
Okay, just to put it in a little bit of perspective.
And there are additional kind of benches as you go down.
Yeah. Further questions for Jason or Josh for that matter? Richard?
You want a motion?
We're under a public hearing. We need to take public comment first, but I will in a few minutes. I don't see any other questions, but thanks.
Okay.
We'll call you back up if anything comes up. Any public comment tonight on this item? Rhonda?
Rhonda Fitzgerald again. So when the 93 West Corridor Plan was being worked on, there was a lot of discussion back and forth about the future of this area and whether or not it was not a good place for multifamily housing. And I certainly was in favor of the idea that this was a great place to build triplexes and fourplexes and so on and use the frontage with professional offices. And there have been several great projects, and this is another great project. And it's really exciting to see somebody doing the right thing. And so I say bravo, and I hope you guys are unanimous in your approval. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. Further public comment tonight on this item? Not seeing any, I'll close the public hearing and turn it back to Richard for what I believe will be a motion.
Got to find the exact wordage here, verbiage. I'm going to move to deny consideration of 8th Street LLC conditional use permit to convert an existing building into professional office and develop a triplex located at 144 West 2nd Street, currently zoned as WR3.
Is there a second to that motion?
For purposes of discussion, I will second.
Motion has been seconded by Councilor Sweeney. Richard, would you like to speak to your motion?
Yeah, I just think what I've seen is this continuous progression of conflict or degradation, what I would consider to be degradation of the bank. I think that there are stability issues that keep coming up. We see the condition, and I mentioned it at the planning board, at the old D.A. Davidson building, that still remains as an unstable area. The area across the river on Geddes has shown instability, and it's very similar, I suspect, in its geologic formation. And then we also see what they had to do on 93 Caro. And I just think that as you get more and more information, that for me anyway, the responsible thing is to say there's a reason we have the Water Quality Protection Ordinance, and this should conform to it.
Further discussion? I'm going to chime in. I spoke to Richard about this briefly prior to the meeting, and since that time I looked at the plans in a little bit more detail, and I think this site's a little bit different, Richard, than perhaps the property across the river from your home, which has since been stabilized with, retaining walls, and I understand your concerns there, but I do believe the sites are a bit different. I won't speak to the geotechnical aspects of the differences in the sites, but on that one site you're referring to, it's a steep forested bank leading down to the river. It's a steeper slope angle, and there were clearly signs of slope movement when you look at the trees and the buttressing. On this particular site, the fact that it's benched, meaning there's multiple terraces leading up to the top of bank. We're also 17 feet vertically above the ordinary high water mark and 102 plus or minus feet from the ordinary high water mark horizontally. I think there's adequate buffer and setback and mitigations being incorporated into this design that perhaps we haven't seen in other applications. I agree with your comment generally, though, that when we developed the water quality ordinance, we never intended for every applicant to take advantage of buffer reduction and buffer averaging, and I hope that we don't continue seeing that, but in this case, I do think it's an appropriate use in terms of the buffer averaging for this particular site. With that said, I've said my piece. Any further comment on Richard's motion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and the motion does fail on a 5-1 vote with Councilor Fury, Hennon, Williams, Sweeney, and Hartman voting in opposition. Is there another motion for consideration? Frank?
Nobody else will? I will. I'll move to approve WCUP 17-13, findings of fact, staff report, and the 15 conditions of approval as recommended by the Whitefish Planning Board on December 21st.
I'll second.
That motion has been seconded by Councilor Williams. Further discussion on the motion? Andy?
If I can find my button there, I guess just a question for staff. Condition number 6, are we comfortable that that's sufficient direction, that we'll get a plan that will take care of the 102 feet from the high water mark back? Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Further discussion, comments? All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign. And the motion does carry on a 5-1 vote with Councilor Hildner voting in opposition. Josh, Jason, thank you for your time tonight. And we'll move on to item 8C, which will be ordinance 18-4, rezoning approximately 0.4 acres of land located east of 325 Haugen Heights Road in Section 27, Township 31 North, Range 22 West in Flathead County, Montana, from unzoned WER, which is the state residential, and, from unzoned to WER, and adopting findings with respect to such rezone, and this will be on a first reading. Hillary.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So this is the westerly half of an unconstructed road right-of-way north of Haugen Heights Road. The easterly half is in a similar process, but with about a month delay, just due to when the resolutions and the deeding all occurred. So the county deeded this right-of-way to the city, this half of the right-of-way, in June this year, 2017, and then the city discontinued, abandoned, and vacated the right-of-way in August of 2017. Upon vacation of the road right-of-way, the ownership of the parcel automatically reverted to the adjacent property owner of 325 Haugen Heights Road, and no longer has county zoning and needs city zoning. So the purpose of the estate residential is a residential district to provide for single-family, large tract, or estate development, typically in suburban areas and generally with city services. All city services are available to this location. Existing land uses existing zoning, suburban residential, estate residential, country residential. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. The growth policy designation for this suburban residential and the appropriate zoning is either estate residential, country residential, or suburban residential. It's suburban residential to the north, south, and west, and urban to the east. Actual land uses are vacant residential or unconstructed road right-of-way. And I would note that 325 Haugen Heights recently received final plat for its subdivision earlier this month, last month, I should say. Surrounding zoning is county suburban agriculture 10 to the north, estate residential to the south and west, and R4 to the east. That's the county zoning for the eastern half of the road right-of-way that should be dropped soon. Estate residential density is 1 unit per 2.5 acres, or up to 2.5 units per acre. This zoning change was public noticed. We only received 1 comment that was in favor, although the comment was actually in referring to the easterly half portion that hadn't been public noticed yet. So review and findings were in accordance with Chapter 7 of the City Code. There's not much of note, just that the zoning matches the adjacent zoning. It implements the growth policy, and the parcel will become part of the backyards for the lots that are already subdivided as part of 325 Haugen Heights. Planning Board meeting in December voted unanimously to adopt the findings and recommend approval to council.
Thanks, Hillary.
Sure.
Questions for Hillary on her staff report? Not seeing any questions as of yet. We will move on to our public hearing for ordinance 18-4. Any public testimony this evening on item 8C of the agenda? Any public comments? I'll close the public hearing and turn it back to council for a motion. Andy.
I would move to approve WZC 17-21, adopting the findings of fact staff report as recommended to us by Whitefish Planning Board from our December 21, 2017 meeting.
Second?
Seconded by Counselor Hildner. Further discussion on the motion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and that carries unanimously. Michelle. Thanks, Hillary. We'll move on to item 8D, which will be resolution 18-2, indicating its intention to adopt amendments to the Whitefish Downtown Business District Master Plan as amendment to the 2007 Whitefish City County Master Plan, which is also referred to as our growth policy. Hillary.
Thank you. So the impetus for this revision comes from a desire to implement the recently adopted strategic housing plan, which recommends that the snow storage lot at the corner of Columbia and Railway be developed for affordable workforce housing. The city is interested in being able to use tax increment funds for a possible housing project on this lot. However, the lot is not currently in the TIF district, which is defined and represented in the urban renewal plan. So in order to change the TIF district boundary, the urban renewal plan must be modified, and I included Dana's memo regarding the process. I think you all got that several months ago. The Whitefish Downtown Business District Master Plan update, which was adopted as part of the growth policy, designates land use at the snow storage lot for parking as of right now. The original 2006 downtown plan designated for high density residential. So this revision to the downtown master plan update would change land use at the snow lot to multifamily residential. And then while we're at it and updating the master plan, we thought we should also update the land use at the corner of O'Brien and 2nd Avenue. This lot was designated for public parking as well, but has since been developed into commercial with mixed-use residential. So the revision would change it back to commercial, which was also what it was in the 2006 plan. So as far as the proposed revisions, land use of the snow lot would revert to the designation described in the original 2006 downtown master plan, and land use of the lot at O'Brien and 2nd Street would also revert to the 2006 designation and reflect its development, which precludes use for public parking. There's a summary page inserted after the title page that details each proposed revision, and the changes are primarily to the maps to reflect the change in the land use designation. The only text changes are on page 70 under public parking, where 2 paragraphs were deleted that discussed both the snow lot and the O'Brien lot for public parking. I'll just mention a couple of the main points as far as how this relates to the growth policy goals and policies. As far as a goal to preserve the character, qualities, and small town feel of Whitefish, the growth policy defines character as by a diversity of residential types and densities, and also by an appropriate scale of development relevant to existing neighborhoods. So the snow lot multifamily residential will certainly add diversity and density to the types of housing. And it also could provide a transition from the industrial rail uses to the north to the existing neighborhood to the south. And then as well, the O'Brien building scale and design are consistent with surrounding structures in that area. Regarding the goal to strengthen downtown as the commercial, financial, and administrative center of the community, by providing housing to employees that can walk to their places of employment and to other services that are provided downtown, would serve to enhance the pedestrian character of downtown that the growth policy encourages, and it would also provide for local employees. The downtown plan recognizes that downtown housing is essential to a healthy downtown just by having people present and animating the downtown. Finally, a goal to encourage infill development in the growth policy. Both lots are good examples of infill development because they're vacant lots surrounded by developed areas. So just before making a decision regarding this amendment to the growth policy, there's some costs and benefits to consider. The primary benefit is that it facilitates implementation of the strategic workforce housing plan, by enabling provision of housing for local employees. Costs have to do with loss of the lot for other uses, such as parking for employees or in special events at Depot Park. The downtown master plan did recognize this lot as one of the few city-owned vacant lots that could be used for parking. One of the other loss of uses is for snow storage, and there are associated costs with moving the location of storing city snow. Public Works did an estimate, and some of the locations that have been considered a memorial park, which would cost about 1.7 times as much as it costs to haul it to the snow lot right now, or the city shop, which would be closer to 4 times the existing cost. And then, of course, any other uses, like for the North Valley Music School or any other possible uses of that land would be lost. So as a summary, the revisions would change some of the land use designations in the 2015 update back to those outlined in the original 2006 Business District Master Plan. The revisions would facilitate implementation of the Strategic Workforce Housing Plan, and there are costs associated with the proposed revisions. At the December 21st Planning Board meeting, Planning Board voted 4-2 to adopt the findings of fact and recommend approval to council to revise the downtown master plan and amend the growth policy. Do you have any questions?
Thanks, Hillary. Any questions for Hillary on the staff report? Not seeing any. Thanks for the report. We did advertise for a public hearing on what will be our own resolution 18-2, and we'll hold that public hearing now. Any public testimony tonight related to this item? Rhonda.
Rhonda Fitzgerald. This is the one I came for, actually. So in the 2005 Downtown Master Plan, this was identified as multifamily housing. And it, at that time, in the capacity diagram, accommodated, I think, more than 60 units, both townhouses and apartments. And this is just a perfect location for that kind of housing, completely locked into downtown, and I very much support going back to that. I think the interim plan identified it as parking. I'm not even sure why, because it really should be housing, and I very much support changing the designation and amending the downtown master plan, and thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. Who's next? Further testimony? Not seeing any. I'll go ahead and close the... Rhonda, again.
Sorry. Also, maybe the snow could be put at the other park, at the other end of Central, where the kids like to build it up for snowboard rodeo tricks, and that would be a really fun thing. They'd like some big piles of snow down there.
Really big piles. I'll go ahead and close the public hearing and turn it back to council. I think that lot was designated parking in terms of land use because of the adopted Depot Park Master Plan Phase 3, which, you know, cited that property for hardscaping and overflow parking for downtown events, for what it's worth. Anyway, discussion, motion? Frank?
Just a random question. If by changing this designation and assuming it eventually becomes, or it gets developed as what I'll call workforce housing, I presume that that would then take this piece of property from something that is off the tax rolls to something that would be on the tax rolls. Is that correct?
Building would be if it was a privately owned building. So because if we own the underlying land and we maintain ownership, then the land value is not taxable, but the building would be taxable.
And Dana, would that be true if that property was ultimately ended up in the hands of the Whitefish Housing Authority as well?
There would be a transition period, but I'm not sure. They don't pay property tax. We end up paying it actually for them. So the city would pay that probably portion, I would think. So I'd have to look at it, what what the Whitefish Housing Authority pays and what they have exemptions from. So nonprofits can definitely, obviously, apply for exemption for property tax, but not assessments, like special assessments, street maintenance assessments.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Dana. Further questions for staff, or can I have a motion?
I move to approve WGPA 17-01, adopt the revised Whitefish Downtown Business District Master Plan, and thereby amend the city-county growth policy and adopt the findings of fact in the staff report as recommended by the Whitefish Planning Board on December 21st, 2017.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilor Fury. Further discussion on the motion? Andy?
I guess just a couple of comments. I agree with Rhonda wholeheartedly. I guess from the depot master plan redo is why we ended up with parking there, but I think we had always envisioned this as housing of some variety. I'm not gonna say that I'm 100% bought into the fact that it got thrown into the housing plan. I think it kind of got a little hijacked along the way. Somebody said, hey, that's a great place to do it, and therefore it just kind of built a little momentum and steam. I'm not aware that's a decision we've ever specifically made as a council or as a city or as staff that yes, that property is designated for workforce housing. That said, I'm going to vote for this, obviously. I think it is a good place for housing, but I think that's a discussion that we do need to have at some point because we haven't really had it. And I just want to kind of go on record to say that we need to have that discussion. So, and so people think it's a fait accompli at this point, I'm going to say that it maybe is or isn't, so.
Thanks, Andy. Further discussion? Frank?
All I can say is I concur with Andy. I think we need to have that discussion.
Katie?
And final, I was gonna bring this up during councilor comments, but it kind of ties into what Andy had to say. A lot of questions about soil testing and quality has come up from the beginning when we've been discussing any type of fate of this lot. And I think I'd like to see a timeline and see what it would cost, what it would take, because we're gonna put the cart before the horse until we actually find out what's in the ground on this piece of property.
Craig, have we initiated testing or completed testing of that parcel? I know we talked about it a couple months ago, or...
No, we haven't. I have estimates from a couple of engineering firms to move forward with that, but we haven't executed either of those.
Okay.
Is because we're waiting to make sure that that's in the TIF, and then once it's TIF, all expenses become TIF eligible.
Okay.
So, but I believe that TIF is coming real soon, and so we'll be able to pull the trigger on that.
Okay. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Craig. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and that carries unanimously as well, Michelle. Thanks, Hillary. We'll move on to item 9, communications from our city attorney, which will be item 9A, resolution 18-3, approving a license agreement with Gold Creek Cellular of Montana Limited Partnership doing business as Verizon Wireless for a new rooftop antenna equipment building and related radio equipment and appurtenances on and near the Emergency Services Center. Angie.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. My report begins on page 397 of your packet. The Whitefish zoning code permits wireless service facilities in the WZB zones provided that the structure is attached to an existing building or structure, is architecturally compatible, and does not extend above the roof line. In April, Verizon applied to the Planning Building Department for architectural review of a project involving the installation of wireless service facilities at the city's ESC building, and the ESC is located within the WB zone. So Verizon proposed to enlarge the existing penthouse on top of the ESC to house antennas and to install some equipment cabinets on the ground. The antennas will not be visible from the outside of the building, and the equipment cabinets will be enclosed by a fence and located near the southwest corner of the building to minimize visual impact. Our review committee approved Verizon's project, subject to the installation of some evergreen shrubs to kind of hide the proposed equipment platform. So the city and Verizon negotiated the terms of a 10-year license agreement, which would allow them to maintain their install and maintain their equipment. It's very, very similar to the license agreement that exists with respect to their equipment Memorial Park. Basically, it requires Verizon to pay rent in the amount of $18,000 for the first year annual rent for the second year, and each subsequent year would be 100% of the annual rent payable with respect to the immediately preceding year. The license agreement basically prohibits Verizon from interfering in any way with the city's use of the ESC, prohibits them from interfering in any way with our existing equipment, requires a CGAL policy, naming us as an additional insured, and if Verizon terminates the agreement prematurely, it requires them to pay basically rent for the rest of the agreement, and requires Verizon to bear the cost of electricity. Kevin Howell and I negotiated this agreement, and again, it's very similar to what Mary negotiated years ago with respect to Memorial Field. He actually wanted to be here tonight. He's in Arizona, but couldn't attend because of a board meeting. He did want me to relay to council that if you have any questions, we can continue this to February. He'd be happy to fly up and answer any questions you might have. Approval of a lease agreement will result in the city receiving $18,000 in the first year and annual increases after that for the remaining term of the agreement. I do have one small change to the agreement itself, and it's my fault, I missed it. On page 364 of the packet, in paragraph 2, it says the term agreement will be effective as of October 1st, 2017. Obviously, that's not going to happen. We'd negotiated this agreement and expected to close on it by then, but the engineers hadn't gotten us the final drawings yet, so it was pushed forward, and I will change that. So I can answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Angie. Any questions for Angie? Richard?
Angie, you said that they would pay for the electricity required. I'm assuming that they pay for the cost of an additional meter?
Correct.
Okay. And then I think you pretty much answered it, but I would like a confirmation, if I could, that this payment is consistent with the industry standard for similarly situated facilities?
It is.
Okay.
Thanks, Richard. Further questions for Angie, or can I have a motion?
I'll move to approve Resolution 18-03, a resolution approving a license agreement with Gold Creek Cellular of Montana Limited Partnership, DBA, Verizon Wireless for new rooftop antenna equipment, building and related radio equipment, and appurtenances on and near the Emergency Services Center.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilor Sweeney. Further discussion? I would just note as amended in terms of that one paragraph that Angie recommended. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and the motion does carry unanimously. We will stay with Angie and move on to what will be Ordinance 18-5, an ordinance amending Title II, Chapter 3 to the Impact Fee Advisory Committee, and this will be on a first reading.
Great, and my report is on page 403 of your packet. This is just basically a little housekeeping amendment. State law requires cities that intend to impose an impact fee to establish an impact fee advisory committee, and we did so back in 2006. At that time, one of the requirements of state law was that the committee include one certified public accountant, and so our ordinance included that requirement. We've traditionally had kind of a hard time getting CPAs on the committee, and I think we've been without one for several years. Fortunately, in 2015, the legislature amended the state law and removed that requirement. So in the interest of actually having a committee that we can recruit members for, the proposed new ordinance just removes the certified public accountant position and just reclassifies that as a member at large. There's no financial requirements or impacts, and therefore staff respectfully recommends the City Council approve the ordinance.
Thanks, Angie. Any question on Angie's staff report? Motion?
Sorry, I have to push my button there though first, but I would move that we approve Resolution 18-5 on a first reading.
Is there a second?
Second.
I think Katie got it.
Got it.
Seconded by Councilor Williams. Further discussion? All those in favor, please rate. Michelle?
Is that resolution or ordinance? Thank you.
Jake? All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand, and those opposed, like sign, and that carries unanimously. Michelle. We'll move on to Adam, and we have Adam's report and close with the packet. Any questions for our city manager? I had one question. How's coffee hour going?
You know, much improved. I had the largest turnout of any of them. It got pretty bleak there for a while. So I think changing the time worked. It wasn't too large that it became, you know, overbearing or turned into a, you know, bash the city fest. It was just great comments and discussion on things that are going on locally. So
you're getting a few people.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks, Adam. Anything else to report on?
Nothing at this time.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item 10C, which is consideration of awarding the contract for the impact fee review and update to FCS Group, and this is on page 406 of the packet. Adam. Dana, you're taking this one?
I'm taking this one.
I should have known.
Yeah, that's okay. Good evening, Mayor and City Councilors. At our last meeting on January 2nd, I informed you that the Impact Fee Advisory Committee unanimously recommended awarding FCS Group a contract to perform our impact fee review and update. Since that time, we've been able to negotiate a contract in an amount up to $44,000, which is within the budget for FY18. We have also included that this project be finished by June 30th, 2018, so within the fiscal year. The cost for this project is allocated among various funds based on the impact fees that are being studied. And if there is money available, we'll be looking at other possible impact fees and just getting information on transportation, affordable housing, and how those could play into the city of Whitefish. Not that we would be setting any of those, but just give us some background information. So with that, staff respectfully recommends that the City Council approve the contract with FCS Group as proposed and authorize the city manager to sign the contract for the impact fees review and update.
Thanks, Dana. Any questions for Dana? Can I have a motion? Frank.
I would move to approve the recommendation that Adam be given the authority to sign a contract with FCS Group and not to exceed $48,000. Is that correct, Dana?
That's correct.
$44,000.
Sorry, 44. Oh my goodness, yeah.
Not to exceed $44,000.
Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Seconded by Councilor Williams. Further discussion or comments? All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that's unanimous as well. Michelle? Thanks, Dana. And we'll move on to item 10D, which is resolution 18-4, adopting a revised and reformatted investment policy. Dana.
Great, thank you. The resolution is on page 415 of your packet, and my staff report is on page 423 of the packet. In March 2003, the city adopted its original investment policy that is currently in effect. Since then, investment laws for public funds have changed, and the Government Finance Officers Association has provided additional recommendations as best practices for cities, towns, and counties. With the need to update the investment policy, I also took a look at kind of how it was formatted and determined that it would be best to reformat it so that it is a little more user-friendly instead of just copying state law into the policy. So provides a little more direction as well. This proposed policy intends to guide the investment activities of the city to provide a reasonable rate of return while assuring the maximum security of principal, meeting the daily cash flow demands of the city, and conforming to all federal, state, and local laws and regulations. The primary objectives of the city's investment activities in order of priority are first safety, then liquidity, and then yield. So a little bit different than maybe your personal investment activities. So with the proposed revisions, you would see more detail. I did provide our current investment policy for you in the packet, but you can tell that the new one is more detailed, provides requirements for certain investments, investment strategies, and performance reviews. One of the more significant changes is that it now requires the finance director to report to the city council on a quarterly basis the status of our investments, including interest earned. I think that this is an important addition for the city moving forward. There is no financial requirement as a result of adopting the proposed revisions and reformatted investment policy. And overall, it's not changing the way that we have been doing it. It's just clarifying how we should be doing it. And this has been formatted based on the GFOA's recommended investment policy with just some tweaks here and there to kind of go with our smaller town finances, but also the makeup of our city government. So just a couple items, again, I briefly touched on page 416 of the packet, it talks about the objectives. So I briefly touched on the safety, liquidity, and yield. Safety of principle is the foremost objective of this investment program, where we will minimize credit risk and also minimize interest rate risk. Liquidity obviously is obvious for me, obviously is the requirement that we reasonably need to anticipate what our spending will be and make sure that we remain sufficiently liquid. So in addition to that, there is state law requirement that we can have no maturities over 5 years. And then of course it comes to the yield, which is after taking into consideration safety and liquidity. And that is, to ensure that we are attaining a market rate of return throughout budgetary and economic cycles. Interest earned can help coffers when we have good interest rates. This year we've seen a significant increase in our interest rates, which is great. So our return on investment is going up. It identifies the investment officers as the city finance director and the city manager. And the city finance director, as I said, will report to the council. So with that said, I'm not going to go through every detail in there, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have in the policy. So staff respectfully recommends that the city council adopt the proposed investment policy and approve the resolution as proposed.
Thanks, Dana. Any questions for Dana on her staff report? Or can I have a motion? Richard?
Sure. There's been some reluctance, hesitation on getting some of these people just jumping in, so I will. I'll move to approve Resolution 18-04, a resolution adopting a revised and reformed investment policy as stated on pages 415, etc.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilor Williams. Further discussion on the motion? All those in favor, please raise your hand, and those opposed, like sign, and that carries again unanimously. Michelle. Thanks, Dana. We will move on to item 11A, which will be Resolution 18-5, a resolution establishing the Whitefish Tourism Master Plan Steering Committee, and this is on page 437 of your packet. Who's taking this one, Dave? Okay. Good point. I guess we'll take it. This was a recommendation, I think, that came, months ago out of our joint work session with the Whitefish CBB. It's in front of you as a resolution, and we'll just need a motion regarding adoption. Katie.
I move to approve Resolution 18-5, a resolution establishing the Whitefish Tourism Master Plan Steering Committee.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilor Fury. Further discussion? I had one question, Adam. I appreciate the language on page 2, the top of the page, which indicates the committee shall keep decisions and discussions within the confines of city council directives. Months ago, you and I had discussed perhaps developing guidelines as we establish these new committees, the housing committee being one of them, of course, just to keep the committee focused so they're not going off on tangents or outside of the intended purpose and intent of the committee and their marching orders that are provided by council. Have you finished those guidelines, or will they be available for these 2 new committees that have been formed?
Well, I added them in to the strategic housing one.
Okay.
So they're already in that one. I think, didn't they make them into this one? Did they get read in? Or did it not?
I don't see them.
We might have copied it just as we got it from I think, Jen pen drafted this one, I think.
Okay.
But yeah, that's something that should be in all of these, so I apologize for not.
Oh, that's quite all
sure
right.
that happens.
Perhaps when we adopt this, if we could just direct staff to include those
say-
guidelines as part of this
Absolutely,
resolution,
we'll add
that
it
would
in
be
there
helpful.
as one of the sections.
Okay, and that's okay with the first and the second?
Yeah.
Okay. Any further comments? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign. And that again carries unanimously, which brings us on to item 11B, which is a continuation from our appointments and interviews with our volunteer boards and committees at our last meeting. I'll move on to item 1, which was the Whitefish Strategic Housing Plan Steering Committee. These are my appointments, but I will need a ratification by the council with a simple majority vote. I'll go ahead and appoint Adam Hammett, Wendy Compton-Ring as staff representatives. I'll appoint myself to the committee. We have 4 at-large appointments, and I would move to appoint Ben Davis, Kevin Gartland, Rhonda Fitzgerald, and Addie Brown as our at-large representatives. And if you would be so willing, I would move to appoint Melissa Hartman and Katie Williams to the steering committee as well, if that's okay with both Melissa and Katie. Okay, I'll just need a simple majority vote ratifying those appointments.
Move to ratify.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that's unanimous as well. Thanks very much for that. And we'll move on to item B2, which I think we're very fortunate to have John Middleton step up to volunteer to be on our planning board. I know John pretty well. I think he's going to be a great addition to the planning board here in Whitefish. We'll just need to affirm the county appointment with the vote.
I'll move to affirm.
I second.
All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that's unanimous as well, Michelle. And finally, we need to make one appointment for either Councilor Williams or Councilor Hartman to the Whitefish Trails Operations Committee. And I'll leave it up to you, to whoever would like to take that on as Katie rubs her temples.
I'll paper, rock, scissors, you. I have served on it. I'd be more than happy to serve on the committee as well. But if you'd like it, you can.
So you've been serving on it?
Mhm.
If you want to continue.
Absolutely. And I would encourage you to actually attend the meetings anyway, just because it is useful as being an LLAC member. So I'd be there anyway.
Okay.
Perfect.
See you there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Melissa, did you talk with Michelle about the boards and committees you were appointed to at the last meeting? Or are you aware of which boards and committees you?
I know that I had emailed some preferences and
Okay.
was told that preferences for the most part, so
Okay.
I don't confirm.
Michelle, do you have those handy by chance?
No, but I'll get a hold of you with those.
Okay.
I believe it was the tree committee.
Yeah, there were a few.
Yeah, but I'll get those to you. I did not
That's
get that
okay.
to you, I'm sorry.
I actually do have the list, so I believe you were appointed, as Michelle indicated, to the Whitefish Tree Advisory Committee and the Legacy Lands Advisory Committee as well, with Andy Fury as an alternate, so.
Did she also back up the park board? Frank on the park board?
Ryan's the
Ryan,
alternate.
okay.
Yeah, Frank was the appointment and Ryan's the alternate, so. Tree Advisory Committee and the LLAC, which I know Legacy Partners excited to have you on
Great.
board for that committee as well, so. Thanks for volunteering.
You're welcome.
We'll move on to councilor comments. Who would like to start tonight? Motion? Okay, we do need a motion to appoint Katie to the Whitefish Trail Ops Committee.
Move to appoint Katie.
Is there a second?
I second.
Seconded by Ryan. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and that's unanimous as well, Michelle. Richard, comments tonight?
Sure. First, welcome, Melissa.
Thank you.
Welcome
Good to be here.
City Council, and it's going to be fun having you on board and helping us make decisions. Secondly, happy birthday to Andy, and big day. And follow up to Jan's question on the BNSF plume. while I don't have any direct information on the plume, I can say or tell you that, to the best of my knowledge, that the DEQ's discharge permit on the BNSF property is still now more than 2 years overdue.
Would you like to direct staff to follow up with DEQ on both items?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Thanks, Craig. Andy?
Other than a welcome to Melissa, nothing.
Thanks, Andy. Ryan?
Welcome, Melissa, and happy birthday, Andy.
Thanks, Ryan. Katie?
Welcome, Melissa. Happy birthday, Andy. And then I'd also like to encourage everyone to attend Whitefish Winter Ski Joring next weekend out at the Whitefish Ranch. And then also join in the festivities on the 3rd for Whitefish Winter Carnival. It's going to be a big couple weeks, and Whitefish is ready to have fun to celebrate our traditional winter carnival. See you there.
Thanks, Katie. Frank?
No additional comments this evening.
Thanks. Melissa?
Happy birthday to Andy, and very glad to be here serving the community of Whitefish on City Council with all of you.
Thanks,
So,
Melissa.
Thank you.
Welcome aboard, and happy birthday, Andy. I have a few items, I guess some of which are more questions, but in our work session when we were discussing the South 93 corridor study, there were some public comments related to whether or not we would be more appropriately served by pursuing a neighborhood plan. Dave, or no, she's not still here. Can you describe to me generally the differences or the advantages and disadvantages of those two options and why we're pursuing a corridor versus a neighborhood study?
Well, number one, the growth policy called for a corridor plan for Highway 93 South, and also Highway 93 West, as well as Wisconsin. And so that was our directive through that growth policy process to do a corridor plan. And corridor plans typically focus on transportation issues, land use associated with the transportation, looking at that as it's a major highway corridor, how that's going to grow and expand, how the traffic affects, the adjacent neighborhoods as well as the commercial growth, and then adjacent land uses, whether they be residential, high density residential, or whatever. So that's what our directive was to focus on, and that's what we're moving forward with is a corridor plan. Neighborhood plans are typically based on a standalone neighborhood that has its own set of issues, independent of the rest of the community. North Valley Hospital is a great example of a neighborhood plan specific to their use there. They didn't really look at a lot of impacts on how they impacted adjacent, but it's really a development plan for that neighborhood and how it's supposed to expand. And so while we can include neighborhoods in our corridor plan and look at the impacts on those things, I think a corridor plan is a more appropriate use there. When we did our Highway 93 West plan, the original scope of work didn't include some of the neighborhoods on like West 3rd Street. The steering committee decided to include those because they did feel like they were impacted. Same thing on the Wisconsin corridor. We included additional neighborhoods that kind of expanded through the steering committee, looking at it in more detail. Once more information came out, once we had open houses, once we had more public input, and they decided to include more neighborhoods that might be impacted and look at how that corridor impacted them. And I feel like that'll be kind of the same process as we look at Highway 93 South.
So you still recommend the corridor study versus a neighborhood plan?
Yes.
Yeah, just to the comments that we received in the work session, I was very encouraged actually to see, residents that live in the county participating in our work session and raising some very valid concerns related to future growth on 93 South. So I would very much hope that we expand the scope of this corridor study to address those, adjacent neighborhoods, to Frank's, point in the work session. So when you go back to the office this week and work with Hillary on updating or revising that boundary for the corridor study, I hope we can also consider possibly looking at additional, parts of that scope of work to ensure that we address some of those adjacent neighborhoods that abut the commercial zoning.
And we will. We haven't established a set boundary yet. So.
Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing that at the next meeting, I hope. Secondly, Mary Flowers brought up, and she's brought this up a few times, and I neglect to recall when you did provide us Kalispell's annexation policy. And then I heard Hillary actually indicate that we actually don't have a standalone annexation policy. Can someone address that for me and whether or not we need to have a work session to not only review our own annexation policy, or whether or not we can learn some things from the Kalispell example?
Well, I mean, in the past, that's been part of our extension of services plan. A lot of communities have a separate standalone annexation policy, and certainly the one that's in our extension services plan is, it's fairly minimal. And there's some stuff that we could probably expand and do a standalone annexation policy that might incorporate some other things. Obviously, the affordable housing study wanted to take a look at some potential things that would be associated with annexation, deed restrictions and whatnot on properties that we're willing to annex. That's something that's got to be looked at and vetted, and there's a lot of impacts and unintended consequences that we might have to consider with all that stuff. But that's obviously going to be part of that. I'm sure the Strategic Housing Task Force is going to look at some of that, and then there's probably some other things that we can look at adding to that. But
is it unique to have an annexation policy embedded in the extension of services plan, or are they typically standalone documents?
I'm not an expert on those, so I haven't looked at them. I know Hillary did look at some other ones in her course of research, but.
Angie, do you have anything to add?
And I don't know that this really speaks to it, but when we're annexing under state law, we're required to have an extension of services plan. So it is kind of, I guess, a logical place for it, but I don't think that precludes us from having a standalone policy as well.
Okay. Well, if staff doesn't mind maybe thinking about that idea in general and maybe reporting back or providing a recommendation back to the council as to whether or not we need to start pursuing a standalone annexation policy, I would appreciate it, just like your input on that.
One of the things that I wanted to see as part of the strategic housing plan when we're looking at that annexation policy, because hopefully as part of that, we're create another little subgroup of people that are, skilled or talented in the area of annexations. And then we can put them together and we could have a list of things for them to look at, obviously to address some of the housing concerns, but then some of these others too. So while we have the smart people in the room, so to speak, might as well cover our bases on all those kind of things. So that's kind of what I was hoping for too. But, maybe when we have our first strategic housing plan steering committee, maybe we can kind of vet that and see if it needs to be something separate or maybe something part of the housing plan too.
And we're hoping that subcommittee gets convened.
I'm going to be sending out an email here tomorrow and try to get a meeting scheduled probably within the next couple of weeks.
Okay.
I'd like to hit the ground running on that.
Great, so maybe we can address it at that time.
That's what I'm thinking.
Frank.
On the same subject, it occurs to me that I would like to have a work session or discussion, a very specific discussion. Am I doing something wrong? It occurs to me that given my current state of knowledge or lack of, I would like to have a review of whatever our current annexation policy is. Because to the extent it's already embedded in our extension of services plan, I think we need to look at that since it's not standalone and we haven't probably looked at it in quite some time.
I would agree with that. If the council would like to get this on a schedule for a future, work session, we certainly can do so. Adam, do you want to check the work session schedule and get something on the schedule?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, thanks very much. Is that the council's direction? Head nods? Andy? Yep, okay. Dave?
If you're going to look at that as a separate policy, do you want us to hold off on moving forward on with the extensions of services plan update until you guys resolve what's going to happen with the annexation policy?
It's a great question. Frank?
I don't see one as exclusive of the other. I don't see one personally as exclusive of the other. I think you can move forward on the plan, the extension of services plan. The question is whether we at some point pull out what is in terms of annexation, what's in the current extension of services plan. I think we ought to know what's there, David, and look at what gaps there might be in it. Whether we amend it in that plan or add it as a separate plan, I think is a discussion that shouldn't hold up our moving forward on the extension of services plan, myself.
Okay, let's just incorporate it into that, and it would be an opportunity since we're updating that plan, to update that. And there's probably opportunity to have a work session prior to that coming back to the council, depending on when that goes to the planning board.
Sounds good. Short list, I'm still going here. Joe, refresh my memory. About a year or two ago, we held that joint public meeting with Burlington Northern Santa Fe at the O'Shaughnessy, and we rolled out our emergency response plan to the community. And I thought at that point we also discussed holding a second public meeting regarding what our evacuation or notification procedures would be in the event of an incident in the downtown area related to the railroad or another type of emergency. Where are we with that? Can you just refresh my memory?
Well, I presented to the council that plan with Back and Oil, and we then talked about there are so many different emergencies, so many different conditions, that we can't have a set plan that says the siren goes off, do this. There's shelter in place where we want people to stay inside. There's events when we want to evacuate. So what we're doing is using the county's OES website, which is updated immediately for us, as a place for people to look for that. And then, of course, we are in conjunction with the police department and other agencies, we'd be doing evacuations or notifications based on events. So it's impossible to have one plan. Time of year, weather, what the event is there's just so many options until we have the actual incident. We can't tell you what we're going to be doing.
Is there a location online where individuals can, see our emergency response plan as well as what those other documents you're referring to are located?
Back then, when I did the presentation, Chuck did put that on our website.
Okay.
Presentation I did. We don't have any other plans documented other than our agreements with the incident management team down at the county level that we're part of, so.
And is some of that information available online down at the county?
Yes.
Just a suggestion.
County OES, we can do some more information on that and get it out in the newsletter for sure.
I think that would be a great idea. That was going to be my suggestion. I'm asked frequently about what our existing plans are that we have in place, and maybe a topic for one of the upcoming city newsletters would be just to direct readers to where they can, locate that information to get better informed. So just something to think about. Thanks, Joe. Finally, just thinking about some of these downtown projects potentially coming down the pipeline, and particularly with the raising of the Frank Lloyd Wright building, I anticipate there'll probably be some type of proposal in front of this council in the next 6, 12, 18 months as that property redevelops, plus what we have scheduled for the planning board. Next week reminds me that, a couple years ago, we did prioritize or discuss revisiting our parking requirements in the downtown and perhaps amending our code to require parking or cash in lieu for parking when developers can't provide on-site parking, that at least they're providing some cash in lieu to help pay for future parking in the downtown. And in light of these new developments, coming down the pipeline, I think it's going to be very important for us to keep our eye on the prize. And really, Dave, I'd like to see planning staff put some work towards developing that cash in lieu program. We've discussed it for many years now. I know your plate's loaded, but I think we need to get ahead of the curve, or we're going to regret not having those codes in place when we see this flood of development downtown. I don't know what the will of the council is, but I would like to see that come to our table for review here in the next couple months. If I can have just a showing of hands or a head nod. And Dave, if you have any comments on that, certainly now's the time to chime in, but I'm seeing general support for that.
We'd obviously have to figure out an amount that each parking space would need to be assessed at.
Right.
We'd have to look at other communities and whatnot, but I'm sure, between Dana and Angie and Craig and I, we can come up with something.
Okay, great. If we could get that on the schedule for in the next couple months, I would certainly appreciate that. And then finally, back to Joe. I've been remiss, Joe. I know that we have meetings scheduled for our long-term planning task force. Can you remind me when that meeting is scheduled for?
We don't have one set right now.
Not yet, okay.
Tomorrow night, I have a meeting with the rural board to find out who finalize their 2 people that are interested, and you were gonna yourself and maybe appoint one more person from city council, and then we'll look at a date.
Perfect. Great, thanks. I thought I missed a meeting. I'm glad I didn't. Anything further from staff or council? Thanks very much. We're adjourned.